So this public hearing is for Community Development Code Amendment 003-22, the Witch Hazel Village South Plan District. The request is to consider approving an order recommending City Council approve Community Development Code amendments for adoption of the Witch Hazel Village South Plan District. Order number 8403 is available. Does staff have any updates or additional information for us?
Planning Commission President Ronald Nash, Planning Commissioners, good evening. Dan Rutsick, Long Range Planning Manager. I want to enter into the record two additional pieces of testimony received this evening. So I'll go ahead and bring them over to you here in a moment.
All right, great. And would you like to do the staff report?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. So before I get started, want to acknowledge that this Witch Hazel Village South Plan District Development Code work has been a team effort. So I joined this evening on the dais by Senior Planner Rachel Marble, who will be assisting with questions as part of this evening's public hearing presentation, and also by Joseph Oth, our transportation systems engineer. So thank you both for being here this evening. I am bringing up the PowerPoint presentation, so thanks for bearing with me. Here it is. Excellent. Perfect. Okay, so this Witch Hazel Village South Plan District public hearing has been years and years in the making, and so I know we have several new planning commissioners here this evening.
Can we close that door down there?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
It's hard to hear. He's got it.
Okay, so yes, Witch Hazel Village South, we have several new planning commissioners here this evening. I want to reiterate that the Witch Hazel Village South Plan District Code amendments for you this evening were a iterative process. So with that, I'm going to launch into the PowerPoint presentation. There will be an opportunity if folks have minor clarification questions as I'm going through the PowerPoint, jump in. But I definitely encourage folks after the presentation to provide more questions if you have them. So with that, go ahead and jump into the PowerPoint. Witch Hazel Village South is a 150-acre urban growth boundary expansion that happened in 2018, December of 2018. So it's located here in white. It almost kind of looks like a boot a little bit. To the west of South Hillsborough, 1,400-acre neighborhood that is building out currently. Witch Hazel Village South has 13 property owners within it. It's 150 acres. There are 7 rural residential properties within the Witch Hazel Village South area, and I want to thank all of the property owners for coming to our multiple different meetings on Witch Hazel Village South, concept planning, comprehensive planning, and now the plan district work. We also within Witch Hazel Village South have a single property owner that has owns or has options on about 80% of the land within Witch Hazel Village South, located directly south of the Witch Hazel Village neighborhood that is nearly built out. The Witch Hazel Village South 150 acres was located within an urban reserve area that was set in 2014, and as part of requesting that this plan area be brought into the urban growth boundary, the city undertook concept planning back in 2017 and 2018. We came up with a vision statement for those of you who call South Hillsborough's vision statement included complete, connected, green. And building off of that, we created a vision statement as part of the concept planning for welcoming, connected, and green. A community that welcomes a diverse mix of neighbors with multiple types of housing choices, There are opportunities for community interaction via parks, pathways, and open space. So this concept plan that was completed in May of 2018 was a fundamental building block for the comprehensive planning that came starting in 2021. So over the course of 2021, we went through and we undertook the community planning that is required by the state. Areas are brought into the urban growth boundary. So similar to the concept plan, that at a high level looked at the transportation infrastructure needs, the water, the sewer, the park needs. We built on that work and the vision from the concept plan to then craft a community plan document to help shape the vision of what the Witch Hazel Village South neighborhood could become over the next 20 years. The community plan document was finalized in early October of last year, and we came to the Planning Commission to seek approval for the comprehensive plan amendments for this future neighborhood, dictating with goals, policies, and implementation measures how this neighborhood could plan, grow, and develop over the next 20 years. We brought forward goals around housing, vibrant community, multimodal and active transportation, environmental sustainability, park systems, public facilities, utilities and services, significant natural resources and wildlife corridors, and finally, comprehensive plan consistency. And so now, if you go online, we have an updated comprehensive plan with a Witch Hazel Village South community plan section that serves as a framework for the plan district code language that is before you this evening. I want to reiterate that throughout the comprehensive planning effort, we had a total of 4 community meetings. We made a point to invite all property owners within Witch Hazel Village South, but also about 1,700 other property owners who live in Witch Hazel Village to the north, or the urban reserve area to the south and to the east. And so oftentimes when we're heading to a community meeting, we're sending out 1,700 letters, because it was really important for us to get input, not only from property owners within Witch Hazel Village South, but from the surrounding property owners as well. We had a total of 4 planning commission work sessions. When you look at the comprehensive plan work that's at the stage for the plan district work, and including 2 planning commission work sessions in June of 2022 and November of 2022, specifically on Witch Hazel Village South Plan District code work. Sent out a tremendous amount of the notices, as well as the required notices heading into this public hearing, the mailings. We have a project webpage we maintain with social media as well. We were poised to come to a planning commission public hearing on January 25th, and unfortunately, due to lack of a quorum, that's a public hearing did get postponed from January 25th to this evening, and we have 6 planning commissioners here in person this evening, so it's fantastic. So the purpose of the plan districts. So it's really important when we talk about the plan district to identify, similar to South Hillsborough that has a plan district in place, what is the purpose of the plan district? And so here outlined on this slide are some variety of the fundamental aspects we wove into the plan district. Before we started on the code language, we very much looked to South Hillsborough, to the east. And South Hillsborough has been such a great model for plan districts work. But also South Hillsborough Plan District is really significant in its section of the community development code. So one thing staff challenged ourselves to do is to come up with a more straightforward plan district that would simplify both for the development community and for staff on the implementation side. And so that was the foundation of the work that we undertook as we dived into the plan district work. We started it last spring, as I mentioned, went to the planning commission with policy questions in June of last year, and then in November. And it really revolved around weaving environmental sustainability and climate resiliency approaches into the code language. facilitating connectivity for all modes of travel throughout the community. Looking to include small-scale neighborhood serving commercial uses into the plan district itself. Creating opportunities for diversity of households. When I mentioned housing, a major state requirement came down in the last couple of years, House Bill 2001, that required middle housing in low density neighborhoods. So when we started the concept planning work in 2017 and finished in 2018, that legislation, that requirement was not in place. But as some of the planning commissioners, or all of them, are familiar, it was about this time last year that the Housing Hillsborough Code amendments came through, opening the door across our city for duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, other middle housing types to come into low density zones. So we very much looked, when undertaking this code work, to understand that those middle housing types would be a given within our low density areas. But what other steps could we take to really promote a diversity of housing for a range of incomes within the Witch Hazelville South Plan District? We also looked how to integrate and connect trees, open spaces, and natural areas with built spaces, provide for orderly and efficient extension of public services, facilities, utilities, and a clear and objective permitting path for development to occur that I mentioned earlier. So I want to provide an update. Since our November 2022 Planning Commission work session, we went back to the drawing board. We heard loud and clear from planning commissioners that there's more work to be done on the code. And so I'm really excited to present the code this evening, 3 months later, that has some really significant language to encourage regulated affordable housing within Witch Hazelville South, and I'll speak to that here momentarily. I also want to point out the Plan District Code now has cross sections for the transportation facilities, whether they be the local streets or the arterials or collectors within Witch Hazelville South, and they have enhanced pedestrian facilities within those cross sections I'll mention here, as well as specific language around street tree species. So those are probably the 3 largest changes planning commissioners that happened since our November work session. So on the housing front, the comprehensive plan sets the stage with, in yellow, the low density residential comprehensive plan designation that can be implemented by a whole variety of zones, whether it's our R10 zone, our 4.5 zone. There's a whole range of low density zones. As I mentioned earlier, Housing Hillsborough opens the door for middle housing to come into the low density zones. But like apartments, for example, are not allowed within the implementing zones of RL. Now, I know there's caveats to that within plan unit developments and other caveats, but I want to point out it was really important to have a mix of housing by reflecting the comprehensive plan designations you see here on the screen that were adopted by council last November, and to reflect that by setting a comprehensive plan land use designations that reflect that range. So in orange is the residential medium density with the implementing zones of R4.5 or MR1. So 2 different zones to implement in the RM zones here south of Gordon Creek or in the northwest corner. And then finally, a residential high density designation was adopted with implementing zone of MR2. And so one major piece that we have amended the code in the last couple of months is in the MR1 and the MR2 zones. Private sector development can get a 50%, can get a 200% increase in the allowed number of in the density, essentially. MR1, for example, has a maximum density of 16 dwelling units per acre. private sector development could get to a density of 32 units per net acre in MR1 zone if they ensure that 20%, at least 20% of the units being developed come in as affordable units for folks earning 80% the area median income and below. Similarly, in the MR2 implementing zone, developers could get a 200% increase. All of this language, or much of this language, is actually embedded in Senate Bill 8 that came through and is in our code. But I think a major piece to point out is that was set up for land that was owned by the public, land owned by nonprofits. And so here we are extending these potential opportunities for twice the maximum density in these MR1s, MR2 zones by ensuring that 20%, at least 20% of units come in that are at that 80% and below. In addition to that, for housing developed by, for example, nonprofit affordable housing developers, Senate Bill 8 allows that 200% density increase in the MR1, but not the MR2. Instead of the 150% density increase. And so we move that in the code to 200% to reflect that. But we also adjusted the several other fundamental aspects of the code to reduce barriers for the nonprofit affordable housing developers that we're hoping will bring an affordable housing project or projects plural into the Witch Hazel Village South area. Happy to go into more details on that, but these are two major changes since our November meeting, and they're very much based on input that we received as staff directly talking to nonprofit affordable housing developers and talking to local government staff from other Washington County jurisdictions and best practices learned from them. And we also had an opportunity to reach out to our private sector partner on this project, who has options on 80% of land, and just ask a question on the incentive language we created, the 200% maximum density. If 20% of the units or more are affordable, is that something that's kind of competitive? You know, is that kind of something that potentially could be something to explore down the road? And we heard, yes, that is meaningful. And so that was really important to us. And I just wanted to share that. So I'm going to pause there. I have more to share, but I see Commissioner Grunow has a question.
Madam President, I have a couple of questions just real quickly. Administratively, who's chasing this down? I mean, putting it in a plan, developer, for profit or not for profit, may exercise some or all of this, but who is going to be chasing this down as to them completing or making sure they fulfill their obligation?
So this was structured, and following up, great question from our planning commission work session back in November. There was a lot of talk about, a lot of discussion around what can we in the planning division impact directly, and first and foremost is the community development code and creating these pieces of flexibility. Within our community development department, we have staff who work full-time on bringing affordable housing across our city. And whether it's in areas that are up against transit or potentially areas like Witch Hazel Village South that are high opportunity areas in terms of new parks, trails, near proximity to schools, this is on their radar. This is not set up that the development in Witch Hazel Village South is required, right, to do this, but we have crafted code language on the nonprofit affordable housing side to taking in the input we received directly from the nonprofit affordable housing developers when we talk about usable open space and a whole variety of other pieces to open the door more to help remove the financial barriers and other barriers that nonprofit affordable housing developers can experience. And then on the for-profit side, it was really affirming to hear input that is something that.
Well, my next question is are you referencing both home ownership and rental in these numbers? Or is this just in the home ownership? Talk about affordability, whether it's for profit or whatever, but does it cut across?
So the code doesn't differentiate between home ownership and rental. There'll be an opportunity. We will be signing annexation agreements with developers. Will be, if not annexation agreement, it will be a developer agreement down the road. So there's a lot more to conversation to have around a lot of these, but this opens the door in a really meaningful way that currently doesn't apply, across our city, but it kind of is exciting to have 150-acre urban growth boundary expansion area, have planning commissioners push staff to dig and really come up with innovative and meaningful codes. So it's super exciting to bring this forward.
And President, my last question I have, Dan, affordability. A unit is built, it's designated in some way, shape, or form as affordable as part of getting increased density. What's the duration? Is that duration of affordability, however somebody wants to define it? We can have a lot of other discussion. Is it for the very first person that benefits? Or does it run with the property under some formula? Or is it first family, first guy in is lucky, second guy might not be so lucky, it may not be affordable? You understand what I'm getting at?
Absolutely. I'm really excited to see that we have partnered with Crown Grounds. Crown Ground is a city recently where they own the land. They lease in a lot of instances, the units above the land. And so the land is permanently affordable. I think when we're talking about the development code, it does not go to that level of specificity, but given the momentum about creating a mix of incomes within this expansion area, I very much look forward to opportunities to have more meaningful discussions. If there are, in fact, home ownership opportunities tied into this, how can it be structured so that the affordability is maintained in perpetuity for the home ownership side, or on the rental side? How do we set an expectation? And I am intrigued by the land trust model because you can have, for example, entities like a Proud Grounds, may own the land in perpetuity. That's kind of a major function that they play. So I'm excited about more discussion to come.
Thank you.
I have just one question, price for clarifying question. So the code is for 80% of AMI, is that correct?
80% below.
80% lower. So my understanding is that the current AMI at Hillsborough is somewhere around $85,000 a year, is that correct?
So it's interesting. I've seen a lot of different numbers. Unfortunately, President Bronash cannot tell you the exact one. And then there's, on top of that, to make it more confusing, there's area median income and median family income, and these categorized. I know that sounds close to what I've heard it recently.
Okay. So roughly, just so that we all have kind of a peg in our head, if I'm correct, it's around $85,000. So we're talking about around a household income of like 70 and below that, right? So anybody who makes around that or below that is going to have access to these units.
Yes,
If the developer chooses to take advantage of these density costs.
absolutely. Or if the nonprofit affordable housing developer develops the housing, their targets are oftentimes 80% AMI below, 60% AMI and below. And so those absolutely would be the income levels that folks would become eligible for the homes.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure my math. Thank you.
Thank you. So great questions. As I mentioned earlier, we can dive into a little bit more of the specifics. I have here a kind of simplified version when we talked earlier about middle housing, whether it's permitted or not permitted in the MR2 or MR1 zone or low density zones. This is, I think, a helpful guide to kind of get a sense of the implementing zones and where different housing types are not allowed, permitted, not permitted, limited. So here's an opportunity to kind of dive a little bit deeper into the code language. So I don't want to replicate this too much, but I did cover the at least 20% regulated affordable housing. Some of the other pieces I didn't talk into too much detail about, but just go over briefly is a maximum lot coverage for multi-dwelling structures may be increased 75%. That's directly from the nonprofit affordable housing developers asking for greater lot coverage opportunity to have more units built. Talked about that a little bit during our Planning Commission work session in November. Is that request that came down from nonprofit affordable housing developers and mentioned the maximum density, maximum building heights. The proposed language coming directly from Senate Bill 8 actually talks about increases in MR1 equivalents, 16 units or lower, or MR2 equivalents. They don't reference MR1 and 2. That's specific to Hillsborough. Every city has their own implementing zone, but they talk about height increases that cities are required to embed in their code. And as part of Housing Hillsborough, we incorporated Senate Bill 8 requirements for greater housing, greater heights in our code already. And we're using Which Hazel Village South to reinforce where Senate Bill 8 was requiring us to go for heights. And in some cases, instead of using a specific height number, we shifted to using stories versus a specific number of feet. And so that's one additional step we've gone. And then I do want to point out, and I didn't emphasize this enough earlier, when it comes to nonprofit affordable housing developers, they are actually eligible for no maximum density. And so if, for example, a nonprofit affordable housing developer moves forward on a 5-acre piece of land in an MR1 or MR2 zone, that they could potentially create, 3-4 story or more building to really encourage additional units. And so that was embedded in our code language that we are bringing forward this evening. And of course, there's now exemptions from minimum off-street parking associated with affordable housing that came down from the state. So that's reflected in the code as well.
Yeah. President, I could. As you know, there's quite a big difference between 2 and 3-story, whatever you wish to call it, versus building a 5 to 6-story, whatever you wish to call it. Not the least of which is fire suppression. And I'm just curious, is it reasonable to assume that the state, to try to increase density, did not weigh in fire code provisions? I raise that only because it sounds like sometimes there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of let's go get them type of attitude going on down in Salem. And I'm just curious, I think fortunately we have the fire apparatus in the city. Maybe other communities don't. So is it safe to assume that the state did not waive other type of provisions in their fervor to increase density? I'm a little concerned, perhaps overly, but it would be great to hear back from somebody that there is a difference between escaping a fire of 2 to 3-story building versus a 5 to 6-story building. I'm just sharing that, and perhaps there isn't an issue here, but I'd like to be reassured since we're talking about waiving things.
Commissioner Grillo, for the record, my name is Rachel Marbles, Parent Development Services. So there was no language in Senate Bill 8, nor is there language in our, which is the Village South Plan District 4 and the special use standards, which speak to the Senate Bill 8 provisions, to exempt any of these developments from fire and life safety codes. The middle housing bill specifically, and code specifically calls out that all of these developments still have to meet any applicable building or fire code standards. So the fire code is based on the number of stories or building height and not based on type of development, and there haven't been any code language, hasn't been any code language introduced that would speak specifically to a type of development versus just meeting the fire code based on the height of the building or fire access requirements or anything that's listed in the Oregon Fire.
So I might just follow up to say, rest assured, commissioners, that the developer that comes in to seek 6 stories is going to have to meet the code. That was what Rachel just said. So whether it's using ladder truck apparatus or standpipes or other sprinkler systems, multi-dwelling unit types of structures, we will need safety.
So the next section, talking about visitability, specifically the ability for folks, individuals with disabilities, folks of all ages. Visitability is the ability to access a home without, for example, multiple steps going up into a home. And so we created a code incentive to reduce setbacks, the minimum front, reduce the front building setback, for example, to be reduced to 10 feet, also allows some maximum lot coverage, some density bonus and some other pieces if the development community voluntarily allocates a certain number of units that are set up in Hazelville South to be set up as visitability. And so that was another piece of the code that we incorporated in. Talked about the neighborhood commercial uses. Commercial uses are allowed on a limited scale throughout the planned area. They must be limited to standalone or mixed buildings that are no more than 5,000 square feet of gross floor area per building. And so we're talking about really tiny, limited commercial uses, but really exciting throughout our concept planning and comprehensive planning, community planning. We heard so much input from folks wanting the ability to go down the street to get a cup of coffee and that opportunity. And so that is embedded within the code language that we put forward.
Good question.
Absolutely.
I noticed in 1268-110 a 1C, which deals with the uses allowed. Retail products and services with following exceptions, blah, blah, blah. Does something like a 7-Eleven type use fall within retail products and services use? I was too lazy to look it up today. So I thought I knew you'd know the answer.
Yes, it does.
So those kinds of uses.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Sustainability and natural resource section, just give you an example here of a cross section that's embedded in our plan. Along local streets, we the code are suggesting moving from a 5-foot planter strip, the area between the sidewalk and the street, to a 6-foot planter strip in order to provide more opportunities for street trees that are larger in size, envisioning a future with Hazelville South where larger trees can flourish over the years and provide the cooling effects that they have during the summer and other benefits. And so we'll talk more about trees here in a moment, but just wanted to highlight that the really big thing we did is we worked with our consultants since we met with the Planning Commission in November to work with arborists to come up with specific tree species list that would be more resilient given the warming climate we're experiencing these last couple of summers particularly. And so we work very closely with our public works department and their consultant arborists to come up with a whole variety of street trees. Typically, our design construction standards that Public Works oversees, it's in our municipal code, dictates the types of tree species, but Public Works in the coming years will be updating that list. And because we had Witch Hazel Village South before us and created this opportunity in the code to have an additional foot on both sides of the street for the planter strips and create opportunities for these larger trees to go in, we thrilled to be able to come up with a list. There, as you may have heard, some trees that are really susceptible, like the ash trees and susceptibility to emerald ash borer that has been located here, unfortunately, in Washington County. And so looking through the lens of which trees, given what our first know today, are the most resilient, was really like an important aspect of bringing these into the code. We also have code language that talks about solar access and lot orientation and stormwater facilities. Speed up a little bit, parks, trail, and open space. We have 2 neighborhood parks identified. One 5-acre neighborhood park north of Gordon Creek, one south of Gordon Creek. We have the Crescent Park Greenway that will wrap from Gordon Faber Recreation Complex westward, wrap around our city all the way to South Hillsborough, pass along the very western edge of Witch Hazel Village South. And that is to be a 30-foot wide greenway with a 12-foot paved trail and landscaping on either side. And so that is a great future park amenity. And of course, there's a proposed trail to wrap along Gordon Creek that I'm hovering over here to connect folks to natural areas as well. So we, in our code, specifically have maps like these park facilities embedded within them. On the transportation.
Quick question on that.
Oh,
if I may.
absolutely, sure.
Just want to clarify, if you can go back to the argument of parks and open space. I just want to make sure I understand correctly. The parks would be publicly owned and developed parks, not operated, correct? And then the open space, would that be something that's owned by the homeowners association and maintained by the HOAs there?
So Witch Hazel Village South over time will develop. I mentioned, for example, all the area south of Gordon Creek is has options from one entity. So let's say this property, these properties here are all annexed at the same time, then they would hold on to ownership of the area. But there's going to be discussions with our parks department because they're going to be running a trail through that area. So in conversations with the parks department, they would likely receive some kind of easement on that land. Some of these, like the wetland areas and significant wetland areas and forest resources, are not going to see development in them except for the trails. And so it may very well be that the natural resource areas, to answer your question, will fall within like the homeowner association. But there's going to have to be a lot of discussions our park department's going to have with property owners piecemeal as they annex, because they're going to want to secure a wide cross section for the trail, this wrap trail system. If it takes the form of acquisition, it may go that route. It may take the form of easement. So those details have yet to be figured out, but that's likely to be a component.
But aside from the trails, it will be private ownership and maintained. Is that what I'm hearing?
It's when our parks department has identified high level costs potentially associated with this. They very much focused on acquisition of land for the parks and to make trails happen. So I believe that is my understanding at this point is that much of the open spaces will remain in private ownership.
The reason I ask the question is I live in the Jackson School neighborhood, as you're probably aware, there's a huge open space there that has trails in it. Those trails are not managed or owned by the city. They're maintained by the HOA. So Well, I guess what I'm hearing is kind of the next iteration of how we deal with open space is that there will be public right of way, at least for the trails. And the city will maintain the trails. The rest of it will basically be a natural area that continues to be owned by
Yeah, and it's like,
private.
I think that's likely to be the case. I'm hovering over the Northern Park. You can see there's an area here with this hatch marks that was proposed to be part of that neighborhood park. So I know our Parks Department will, as part of, like, for example, this neighborhood park, acquire additional land beyond the park. You know, beyond this park area here, that's actually the open space and the active park space. They will look to purchase some additional land for, for preservation, and they may not have access into that particular section, but I think that's likely will involve our Parks Department. They're buying land outright for the park trail itself, maintain that trail, or get easements versus acquire all of this open space or look for a dedication of some kind. I think it's the former, not the latter.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. On the transportation front, for the planning commissioners who remember the Witch Hazel Village South Comprehensive Planning, we have two different alignments for Brookwood as it comes down through the Witch Hazel Village South area to River Road. I want to point out that the Plan District Code language before you this evening is following a different process than the locally preferred alternatives alignments work, the LPA work that will be ongoing in 2023 now. I can't believe it's still saying 2023 now. So I want to point out that the LPA, the locally preferred alternative alignment, will help inform, will, for example, Brookwood cross Gordon Creek here approximately, or remain along the eastern edge of the Witch Hazel Village South Plan area. I can tell you that our transportation committee had a chance to look at a very high level at these two alignments and made a recommendation back in December for the general alignment that goes over Gordon Creek along that kind of western or westernmost edge here. The locally preferred alignment has so much work to come. There's our transportation system folks working diligently with property owners to kind of figure out all the details. Nowhere in the comprehensive plan maps we brought forward was that intended to be, this is the specific alignment, it's a high level. Similarly, in our community development code, we are showing two separate alignments for Brookwood at this point. And as the locally preferred alternatives alignment gets finalized for the crossing of Gordon Creek, we'll come back into the Witch Hazel Village South Plan District Code and amend the maps to show the singular alignment, but we're not there yet. And that's why you see two different alignments. As I mentioned, our transportation committee made a recommendation to City Council for that western alignment, but our code at this point, because that process has much more work to be done, our code is showing both alignments at this point. And wanted to just point out there are cross sections. For example, this is River Road. And just one point I mentioned earlier, there's a 30-foot wide cross section for the Crescent Park Greenway. Some parts of the Crescent Park Greenway is that wraps from the Gordon Favor Recreation Complex westward and around the city will have a really kind of rural experience because it will be out in areas that are very rural in nature. Other experiences will be more urban. So what you have here is an example, kind of a more urban example of the Crescent Park Greenway along the western edge of Witch Hazel Village South, where there will be a shared use path for bikes and pedestrians, joggers and runners, and everyone to enjoy use of the path, and then it will have this landscaping on either side of it. So really excited to see these cross sections come forward. A lot of work went into them. When we talk about the Brookwood within Witch Hazel Village South, we are proposing on the west side a shared use path that moves folks seamlessly up to the elementary school and middle school in Witch Hazel Village neighborhood. And so as future housing comes into Witch Hazel Village South, the opportunity for individuals families to use the shared use path. And not have to cross Brookwood in order to come back to the schools on the west side. And so I'm excited by this shared use path. You can see northbound, there's a cycle track separated by a planter strip and then sidewalk. And this ultimately will be a county facility. This isn't, well, yeah, this all of Brookwood, south of Tualatin Valley Highway is currently a city facility, but it's to make its way into being a county facility going from Tualatin Valley Highway down to River Road. So this is ultimately the cross section for this is very much on the direction that county will move on this. So we very much as staff want to recommend a great way to help move folks into the Witch Hazel Village neighborhoods and north and back. We are proposing 6-foot wide sidewalks within Witch Hazel Village South. That falls along collectors. You can see it's found here along the arterials, and of course, when we get down into the neighborhood routes and even the local streets, there's 6-foot wide sidewalks. This is larger than our design construction standards require, but very much mirror some of the larger wide sidewalks there within the South Hillsborough Plan District itself. Really wanting to create opportunities that we heard throughout our planning effort to allow folks to make their way without a vehicle, without a bike within the Witch Hazel Village South neighborhood. So really exciting to see these cross sections get finalized. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. Questions?
Commissioner, I'm gonna let Commissioner Shaw.
Good evening, Commissioner Saka. Thank you so much for this presentation and the details that you provided along with the imagery. It definitely clarified a lot of questions they had coming in. I just gonna go ahead and start here with, was it MR1 and MR2? I am concerned about the higher density in that area because it wasn't too long ago that we as a commission thought that in the South Hillsborough area, we didn't want it to increase about 2.5 stories. And now we're saying that we're okay with having 6 stories in certain areas. And we're saying this and I'm not hearing about the additional resources that we're going to provide for that increased density in that area. So that is something I would like a little bit more clarity on.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I mentioned earlier that when it comes, for example, to affordable housing, you saw in the presentation that code is currently proposing no maximum density for nonprofit affordable housing. Then we talked earlier about the heights going up. And so some of it's, when talking about my understanding of Senate Bill 8 is our code currently, when it comes to affordable housing, has increased the heights, I think 16 feet within our code, in MR 1 or 2, quite a bit. So that currently lives in our code today for specifically affordable housing. And so part of what the code's doing is reflecting that, but calling it out explicitly for Witch Hazel Village South, because when it comes to affordable housing, that's kind of a given. We have shifted from, like I mentioned earlier, saying it's X number of feet to going to stories, because it seems like folks appreciated trying to visualize stories versus that. But to your question, Planning Commissioner Saka, is very much that the for-profit trying to achieve, height increases and some of these other pieces, come into play potentially when it comes to affordable housing. But perhaps, Rachel, you could speak to kind of additional height or density associated with market rate housing.
Yeah, so to kind of continue what Dan was already mentioning. So part of the height increases that we incorporated into the Witch Hazel Village South Plan District were reflective of the Senate Bill 8 allowances. So the special use standards in our code in section 12.40 already allow for height increases for regulated affordable housing across the city. And so we incorporated that into the Hazel Village South Plan District, but also instead of specifically calling out feet, instead just deferred to stories. Different sections of our different zones in our code regulate based on stories versus feet. And so it's a little confusing. So in order to clarify that, we just made it based on stories and not based on an additional feet number. The specific example the Planning Commission recently saw was in a lower density single dwelling area in Reed's Crossing. And how this increase is meant for multiple dwelling structures within the MR2 zone and MR1 zone. So it's a little bit different context than what we saw in what you all saw in Reed's Crossing, which was area that they were requesting height increases where there were 2.5 stories, single attached and detached dwellings, and not multiple dwelling structures or apartments. So it was a little bit different context, but this specifically would apply within areas where we are looking for or anticipating apartment multi-dwelling units. And those height increases already exist in the code, but we expanded those and really the entire 12.40 Senate Bill 8 section within our code to be applicable not just to regulated affordable housing that's developed by nonprofits or public entities, but to market rate housing or developers that are including affordable housing in their developments, and also to any type of regulated affordable housing. So some of those height increases already existed, but they were limited based on who was building it and where they were building it. And so we've just expanded that more. But I think as far as your concern maybe is more based on the context of it and it not being located in a single dwelling, detached dwelling area where you're mostly going to be seeing homes, individual homes on their own lots. And most of our zones that have that height limitation is 2.5 stories or 35 feet. And that's not necessarily the zones that we're talking about, the height increases being in place in Hazel Village South.
One other thing I'd like to add to Rachel's really good explanation on context, Commissioner Soccer's great question and concern is that, I think the commission was also being context sensitive to the fact that entitlements had already been allowed, development had already begun, and the developer was trying to sort of change midstream a little bit so that you're going to have some changes in what the investment expectation was for residents that already moved into that neighborhood. Whereas here, we're talking about sort of a fresh canvas without development. So anybody moving to the neighborhood will understand what the amounts are for.
And thanks, Rachel and Colin, just to add, because this is something that's come up when we've answered questions when other folks have asked, is it's specific to affordable housing. So these don't come to bear from market rate. Multi-dwelling structures if there's no affordable housing component to them. But one thing that we heard loud and clear from the nonprofit affordable housing developers is the cost of acquisition of land, cost of materials to build units. If they create an opportunity to have more units in a project, response to the great need for units, they would love that. And that's where that no maximum density for affordable housing came from. And they are so excited at the opportunity for a growth area like Hazel Village South to be one where, with these new park spaces, these trail systems, with potentially some small serving commercial uses, schools in the north, to have folks who are at lower incomes to live here. And so they very much recognize that though there may be some higher density on their site, they're going to be creating opportunities for housing for individuals and families that are really super close to a brand new neighborhood with fantastic, as I focus on, sidewalks and bike paths and all these other things. And so that was really important for them. And I want to share that out as well.
I can't operate my microphone. I was like, did you have any other questions, Commissioner Scott?
I would have. I'd like the opportunity to listen, so.
All right, great. Commissioner,
So I guess my one thought in this discussion is perhaps this might be another subject of many subjects in our work session. That's kind of a refresher of density, where we've been at, where we're kind of at based on a particular special comprehensive plan district that we have, including this one, and kind of where we're kind of being, I'll say this, kind of gently being pushed by the state. In terms of additional density, I think it would be helpful if we all kind of understood where we've been, where we're at, perhaps where we're going in terms of density, if for no other reason. When a particular project comes in, someone's unhappy, I think it'll give us a little bit of comfort as a planning commission if that comes before us, be able to engage in conversation with the community of the end. So that would be, I know we probably have a lot of things for the work session. Second thing, I also want to thank you, Dan and Rachel, just great work, quite frankly. Trees, I think it is way past time that the city got its hands around trees and tree width in terms of strips. I would encourage you to consider requiring, root diverters as wired equipment, planting a tree, a public right of way, or any place else, even on a private street, if it's less than, I don't know, pick the number. It's been a little bit of a disaster from my perspective in our neighborhood, one section where the strip was just too narrow, wrong tree, inconsistent use of root diverters. Now we have another area where it feels like you have to walk up, walk down, people shaving their sidewalks, spray painting, and so we can move forward while we try to rescue what we've already kind of created. I think we may be dead. Another point I want to make is I'm all for high density. I think it's great, particularly if it's designed well, built well, maintained well. I'm still kind of struggling. It doesn't mean it can't happen here. I think this is great, but it seems like we are two ships passing in the night between trying to get more density and trying to create viable transportation options. And I can't, it hasn't been that long since we had a presentation here where somebody told us, too bad, how sad, in terms of our transit options in our city. And so I'm not here to tell the staff you have to fix it, because I don't think you can. But I just caution that there seems to be two ships passing in the night here between having people with lower and moderate income in an area that is, I don't know, what's our analysis? So many quarter mile, half mile away from a viable option. And so I just posit that out there, which is, I think, sometimes these things do have to kind of mesh a little bit in order for it to work. Another comment I would make is, the pedestrian crossings that you want built and authorized on Brookwood Extension before you turn the project. Okay, because I think you may have problems in the future. If you want to have a pedestrian only crossing, you turn the street over to the county. Again, you have two ships passing in the night here as it relates to transportation. We want people to be close together, we want more movement. And invariably, we've got to move people on foot, on bicycle, across major roads to get to a school, to get to a park or whatever. There seems to be a difference of opinion how to do that in this county still. Thank you.
Working to my left, I'm not used to having so many people in here, so I forget. Commissioners to my left, Commissioner Ford, Commissioner Tony, you have a question?
I have one. Dan, piggybacking off of the last comment that Commissioner Grillo made on the Brookwood extension. So I saw two maps with the connection down to River Road. One was crossing Gordon Creek and the other was straight. And then there was another, looks like another street that would go across the MR2 zone. I'm just trying to understand what the trade-off is on that. I figure just from my vantage point, if it's better to just have Brookwood go down straight on a straight line expanding south and have another street. If it's a, if you have a portion of regulated housing, affordable housing, higher density, and what the value is of having a street connected. An additional street, yeah, that one. So you can see there is a road A and a road B on one alignment, and then there's just a road A on the other. So, can you repeat your question? I'm just wondering if we, instead of choosing this option, if you go with the other option, you have that other street in the red in the middle. The road B. Yeah, road B. Yeah. So the thinking behind that was, you'll have in this scenario development south of Gordon Creek that through local streets would connect. Local streets are not allowed to connect directly to an arterial, which River Road is. And so local streets would then connect, in this scenario, the Brookwood to get out to River Road as an example. To carry that forward here, if Brookwood were to follow the eastern edge of Hazel Village south and make its way here, then all of this development would have to then go to Brookwood here or here, and it needs a neighborhood route to do that because local streets cannot go directly into arterials. And so in this instance, and I definitely, I should actually stop and let Joseph off right here jump in, because I feel like I'm starting to get over my head a little bit.
For the record, this is Joseph off the City of Hillsborough Transportation Systems Division. And Craig, can you talk a little bit more about the alignments? If you have a moment.
Yeah, while the Craig's coming up, thanks, Joseph. Craig. The road B was also floated in order to just create a kind of connector through the neighborhood, so that if this alignment, as it's shown, has folks traveling here, that folks like here don't have to go east and then come west again. And so there's some fundamental design aspects of that, but this is all super high level. The comprehensive plan amendments that we brought forward last fall contain these exact kind of conceptual alignments. So you're asking a great question. The plan district mirrors them because they're in our comprehensive plan now, but so to me, that just makes more sense to have road be through that neighborhood. Obviously, I'm not the expert, but you're saying they haven't made a decision about which way to go on this yet. So there are pros and cons to each process of a locally preferred alternatives alignment. So I'll turn it over to Greg to kind of talk a little bit about the pros and cons.
Sure. Thank you very much. And it's nice to be back in front of the planning commissioners. My name is Greg Snyder. I'm a transportation planning supervisor for our transportation systems division. So you're hit a great point. This is being discussed right now at the transportation committee, where we are noodling, if you will, the pros and cons, as Dan mentioned, between alternative 1 and alternative 2. Alternative 1 has a lot more road miles. There's more roadway in it. if you just take a look at alternative one, there's 3 east-west roadways, and they're shown here, Pheasant, Road B, and Brookwood. If we were to go to alternative 2, you would see that there were 2 roadway, east-west roadways. One is Brookwood, and the other is Pheasant. And if you could roll to the next one, there you go, alternative 2. Alternative 2 has less streets in it, by several thousand feet. It delivers the same connectivity as Dan mentioned with local roads connecting to Brookwood and Pheasant, and Road A as as neighborhoods are built around them. So it's cheaper to maintain, less infrastructure devoted to streets, and provides the same connectivity. So those are the kinds of questions that are being asked at the Transportation Committee level in terms of where the exact roadway alignments go. And that process is called a locally preferred alignment or alternative process. It's underway now. In particular, we're looking at Brookwood and in just both inside the urban growth boundary in Witch Village South and also outside as well. So there's an active ongoing process to determine what's the best and highest use for transportation in this area.
Thank you. My only point is that it sounds like in the MR1, MR2, higher density neighborhoods, that we should evaluate what the trade-off is of having an extra street, right? So
Yes,
that's the main.
yes, that's right. Thank you.
Commissioner Ford.
Hey, Dan, I have a question for you. Can you make sure some of the apartments are wheelchair accessible and ADA acceptable if a nonprofit wants to build there? Make sure they're ADA compliant. That would help a lot if a nonprofit wanted to build an apartment complex.
Yes, thank you so much, Commissioner Ford, for that. I know I mentioned the language we have in the code about visitability. So if it's a single detached unit, there are incentives to not have a stairwell up to the unit for all of the development. When it comes to the multi-dwelling structures, I know that a 3-story apartment may not have an elevator built into it. And so when we're talking about like nonprofit, affordable housing developer or for-profit, creating opportunities for ground floor units that more seamlessly can be accessed from the street is super important. If there's an opportunity for multi-dwelling, nonprofit, affordable housing project, and there's elevator in it, that would be fantastic, because if there's an opportunity to have community members, be able to more seamlessly access units, that's incredibly important. Thank you for that point.
Any other questions? Commissioner Bennett.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, thank you very much for the work that you've done. It's quite clear to me that you've been actually listening to the comments that we've made previously, and that not only makes me feel good, but it gives me faith in the way the process works, and I want to thank you for that. I have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. With regard to the density, you probably know from comments I've made previously about making housing more affordable as opposed to talking about regulated affordable housing. That I believe it's the Planning Commission's obligation to take every opportunity we can to do that. And I've done a fair amount of reading about making housing more affordable. And one of the themes that keeps repeating itself over and over again is density. And one of the ways you make housing more affordable is to have more units that can be built so that the units that are made available on the marketplace are more reasonable in cost, whether they're rental units or ownership units. So I've kind of come to be a believer in density as one of the main factors that the city can use to create more housing within Hillsborough that's affordable to more people. So I'm very thankful that we're not only increasing density, but providing incentives to do that. I think that's a wonderful thing. The second comment, I can't go further without saying this, is that I really appreciate the way you handle parking. And, you know, the provisions for credit for on-street parking. I've been an advocate for a while now of reducing the amount of parking spaces that exist on the property and trying to get, you know, trying to use the land that's being developed for people instead of for cars. So I appreciate section 1268-340 that provides some incentive to get some parking on the street. I think those two things, the density and the credit for the on-street parking, are huge steps in the right direction of helping make housing in Hillsborough more affordable for a much wider range of future citizens. And I'm really thankful that you're exploring those kinds of things. And I'm anxious to see how they work. I'm sure you're going to be tracking that to see, you know, how those incentives work and whether we actually make more housing that's more affordable for our citizens. So thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. Couple of questions. I share Commissioner Grillo's concern about enforcement of the 20% issue, and I'm wondering whether we can have the development agreement section basically allows us to use development agreements as a condition of approval for projects. Whether we can't tweak the language in the development agreement part of the code for this community to basically say that if there is a bonus, a density bonus that's granted for regulated affordable housing to increase density, that be reflected in the development agreement, so that because that development agreement ends up getting recorded and it has an impact on the property for a longer period of time. So I'd like to at least explore if there's a method that we could use through the development agreement to create an enforcement mechanism for the city to use to make sure that actually happens. Last question I have is one of the items that came to us tonight from, I think it's the Metropolitan Housing Group, is that right? Asked that we include in the code some language from a vesting trips memo of 2723, and I'd like you to at least respond to that request and help us understand why that might be needed or whether it isn't.
I think let's take the last question first and ask Joseph to respond. We've been working with MLG on a trip vesting memo, and Joseph has written that and collectively with Greg and I. And so Joseph, if you could respond to that first question or the last question.
Yes, quick record, this is Joseph off the city application for this division. And yes, we received that request and we looked into it. There is no locally improvement district plan for West Angel itself. There is no type of limits we have like in Jackson East area with data centers here in West Angel itself. We didn't see a need to establish an official trip vesting for the area of West Angel itself. The our community development code already kind of addresses trip budgeting through like the in-process traffic process. And so when a traffic impact analysis comes in, it will look at a prior trips that were recognized through it previously approved land use. And but what we kind of did is that we kind of did a similar method did for South Hillsborough, where we kind of recognize that if you're the first one that comes in with a annexation agreement, we will recognize those trips and put the additional following annexation agreements where they usually have a traffic impact analysis associated. They would recognize those trips that were in the prior annexation agreement that was submitted. And so we're going to formally through that. Through a memo, that's where we do a South Hillsborough.
So you're saying we don't need that code, that language in our code, that's done?
Correct.
Through the development process instead.
It will be done through the development process.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Is there an answer to the
Oh,
first question?
Can I ask on your first question, a clarification, are you asking that we consider through a development agreement requiring that 20% of the units be affordable? Or are you asking that if a developer is intending to use a density bonus, that we do that through a development agreement?
The latter.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think we should require it.
Okay,
I'm just saying that if a developer asks for it, and we approve it, there needs to be some kind of mechanism that makes sure that that's enforced.
yeah. So the way that the density bonus is written into the code right now, if it was a market rate developer wanting to use that 20% increase, or the density increase, I guess, depending on what the zone is, and 20% of the units would be affordable. They have to be regulated affordable housing units, which our code requires that a state or federal compliance contract be in place, and that the units have to be affordable for a minimum of 30 years through that contract. So there is a mechanism in place in our code already that requires that. They can't just say they're going to be affordable units and then kind of leave it up to them to make sure that happens. There has to be a compliance contract in place.
And where in our process is that addressed, if at all?
So if it was.
In other words, I guess what I'm saying is, it sounds like that contract is in place, that's between the developer and not at some agency, not the city of Hillsborough.
Right, that's correct.
So my question is the city of Hillsborough okay with not having a dog in that fight post approval?
So if it was a multi-dwelling apartment building, it would have to go through the development review process, which depending on what they were asking for would be either a type 2 or type 3 development process. Part of that development review process would be documentation of the regulated affordable housing contract being in place.
So you're saying that there would be a condition
Correct.
in the approval of that project that would require that contract to be in place, and if it weren't, then the city could go back and
Correct.
say, you can't have the density if you don't have this contract in place.
That's correct. And that's consistent with how we would treat any regulated affordable housing being proposed across the city. Obviously, they're not using a density bonus, but how we would treat them through the development review process, as far as conditions of approval and ensuring that it's actually regulated affordable housing.
Okay, that leads me to one other question, and this may be a stupid question, category stupid questions. And if it is, feel free to say that's a stupid question. It sounds like most of these situations are going to come up in an apartment type of use as opposed to a, let's say, condominium. Is it possible if a developer wants to come in and develop a condominium and get the density bump that they can say, let's say it's 100 units, that we're going to make 20 of these units fit within regulated affordable housing? Could that happen? And if so, do we treat it the same way? And how are the units that are affordable identified so that the requirement that that affordability be attached to a specific unit in the project.
Yeah, so condominium projects are typically developed as this in a similar fashion as apartment buildings, and the condominium platting actually occurs at Washington County. So the creation of condominiums isn't something that the city regulates or deals with. That condo platting is done through the county. So I don't know that I have any examples, particularly in the city, of a regulated affordable housing developer creating condos, but they would have to have show documentation that the number of affordable units or their regulated affordable housing that's in place through their contract is going to remain regulated affordable housing at 80% AMI or less. If they were going to turn those into home ownership or ownership units versus rental units through the condo process. Because if they didn't, they would be in violation of their regulated affordable housing contract by creating condos and selling them at market rate. We do have, it wouldn't have to be apartment dwellings. I mean, we have one example or two examples, I guess, in the city right now, regulated affordable housing that's going up. That's homeownership opportunities through Habitat for Humanity. So it doesn't have to be apartments. It's most typically apartments or condos is the other example you asked about, but it wouldn't have to be that housing type.
Okay, so would the city handle the hook, if you will, that I mentioned earlier? You would have a condition of approval on an apartment project. Would the city deal with that issue the same way if it were like the Habitat for Humanity or condominium? There would be some kind of condition of approval in the city's process that would require that contract in place so that there was some kind of an enforcement mechanism.
Yeah, that's correct. Our regulated affordable housing definition and the part of that definition that deals with the compliance contract and the terms that they're your limit doesn't differentiate between ownership or rental or
Okay.
housing. It applies across the board.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Appreciate the thorough answer.
There are no stupid questions.
Yes, there are.
Well, we didn't have fun as that. All right.
You've
So-
been around actors, have you?
So at this point, does anybody have any other questions?
I do. Commissioner Soccer. I read about the electric car charging stations and I thought that it was gonna be 40% of all vehicle parking would provide electrical service capacity. And I'm discussing the trends when we're talking about 20 years from now, 30 years from now, and we're shifting to more electric vehicles. Is it at all possible that we can increase the 40% to 50 or even ambitious 60%?
So maybe just to start out, Rachel, can you recall, because we worked on this code over the course of multiple months, about the 40% threshold. I'm trying to go back and.
So this code is the way it's written is reflective, and I don't remember the piece of legislation that was requiring it. The ORS reference is in the code, ORS 455. 417. The requirements for electrical service capacity, not equipment. So the requirements that came out of state law requiring that essentially new parking spaces that are developed within multi-dwelling and mixed-use buildings of more than 5 units provide the capacity for that to be installed. So they aren't, just to clarify, they aren't requiring that 40% of the spaces have EV chargers when they're developed. They're requiring that 40% of the spaces have the capacity. What that typically looks like is conduit in place so that EV charger could very easily be installed without ripping up improvements, curb and paving that have been done. And then also providing space for the equipment. There's a fair amount of space that's needed for obviously the actual court itself, And I'm not an EV charger expert, but for the board itself, but then also for the transformer equipment that goes along with it. So they have to develop the parking lot so that it could facilitate that without putting that equipment in the right of way or removing parking spaces to do it, which is how a lot of the retrofit has been happening right now. Either it's going in landscape strips that were not really created for that purpose, or taking up parking spaces to put that equipment in. So the 40%, I believe, came in our code is kind of directly reflective of that state requirement. And it's again for capacity, not for the actual equipment to be installed.
Did you, question answer me again?
I appreciate the clarity, thank you.
Commissioner.
Sorry, I have another question. I wrote it down but didn't ask it. This gets back to the enforcement of the density bonus for the regulated affordable housing. Let's say we have a project that is proposed in phases. Let's say it's a 3-phase project. I don't think there's anything in here that addresses phasing and how the density is applied. I would hate to be in a situation where phase 1 takes all the density bump in phase 2, but doesn't have the units in it. And they say, well, we'll put them all in phase 3. Is there a way we can assure that to the extent that they get a density bump that they are required in each, and that density, that project is phased, that they need to have that, that density bump reflected in each phase of the project? Good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we don't have any other current examples of this type of density increase. The only other example I can think of is, the way we treat other phased projects. And one example that comes to mind is the Butternut Creek Village, which came before the commission last fall. And they had a phased project. It's 4 blocks, which are going to be built out in 4 different phases. Part of the code requirements, part of the application review and showing that they were meeting code requirements, for example, we looked at open space requirements within each of those phases and made sure that each of those phases was meeting the minimums and not, to your point, in this open space example, we didn't want phases 1 and 2 to be built out, have a market, slow down or crash, and then have no open space if they were proposing it like all in phase 3 or all in phase 4. So I would think that we would treat it similarly as far as a density increase going for phase projects we're looking at. We would probably look at it as far as if you're getting a density increase across the project, that you need to have 20% of the units be affordable in each of those phases, and not say, oh, we're going to have all these affordable units in phase 3, because that's how we have typically treated minimum code requirements in other phase projects.
Is there a reason why we just can't have a simple provision in here that says a project that's receiving a density bonus is phased, that the density bonus shall be reflected, on an appropriate percentage basis in each phase? And if we're writing on a clean slate. I think we can do that fairly simply. Is there a good reason why we would not do that? Other than the expediency of getting something approved tonight, which I don't think is a good reason.
Yeah, so there's some deliberation occurring. I'm trying to think of why we would, I guess short of, anything that we put in the code, we don't have that provision in there for other code standards in 1250 development and design standards. So I guess for across the board applicability sake, if that's already how we're treating other code standards, then we would treat it the same way. I don't know why we would specifically have something in here that speaks to phasing within these affordable housing developments. But there may be thoughts from the other folks at this table.
Listen, I spent a lot of years representing developers. And developers, attorneys, you know, if the code's not clear, they'll use that. I mean, it's what lawyers do. I mean, we're paid to be creative in what we do. What I did. So if it were reasonably clear in the code that if you're asking for a density bump, that may be appropriated across whatever number of phases there are, that there's gonna be less possible. I just don't want to get in a situation where the regulated affordable housing are the tail. It's not waking it up.
President, I will weigh in that I certainly understand that because of, you know, certain experience. And my concern, and so I'm trying to think creatively, is that, you know, we don't want to get, you know, disincentivized either. So if somebody is able to come out of the ground with a market rate to start with, and then is able to catch up with the subsidized product later in that 100-unit condo project, you know, do we have a
All
problem?
you have to do is say not less than.
I'm sorry.
All you have to do is say not less than.
Yeah, well, so, yeah, so were you suggesting
I mean, you
a
don't want-
percentage of the affordable through those phases?
Yeah, all I'm saying is that, for example, let's say it's a 4-phase project, you would say that each phase shall have not less than 20% or 25% of the total added units. I mean, that way it's, I mean, you're right, I wouldn't want to have a disincentive to say, well, we can only put 20% or 25%.
Yes, I think we did a proportional share for each phase. That made sense to try to make sure that we ensure that we capture that.
Yeah.
I think that's essentially an interesting thing. We'll get back to tracking it administratively, but I think you condition that.
Yeah, so, yes, as a real-time code provision being proposed in the ordinance, where we have the applicability that states in order to be eligible for the exceptions in 2 through 5 below, which includes the density increase, at least 20% of the total number of units in the development must be designated as regulated affordable housing that meets the definition, CDC 12.01.500. We could add the statement for phase development projects, this shall be calculated per phase.
It's okay. That works perfectly for me. It's okay with staff. There is.
Yes, I think it's a great suggestion.
Okay, thank you.
I would make a motion to approve that.
I think we make the motion at the end.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, there will be motions, yes, but we do that at the end.
And when that motion is made, we'll want to make sure that we include the proposed to the code, that section. And I want to just return to Commissioner Saka's question on electrical vehicle charging.
Of course, yeah.
We're all anxious to recognize, you know, the idea of a reach. The House bill that Rachel was talking about was House Bill 2180. It's passed by the Oregon legislature in 2021, and it required 20%. So at 40%, we're already reaching beyond what. And I don't know, and I'll certainly bring to our retreat, you know, what the vehicle, you know, what the pressure of the absorption rate or the changeover of the fleet from internal combustion to gas is going to be. And so they're again requiring the expenditure ahead of time. We're in this balance that we'll talk a lot about. I don't want to get too far ahead. We're still putting together the cost of housing and maintaining affordable is all sorts of components like getting more units, but it's also not requiring more upfront costs before the market's ready to absorb it. So it's a balance point. I just want to understand.
Appreciate it, thank you.
All right, any other questions at this point? All right, I'm seeing none. So at this point, I'd like to call for a testimony from the public on this agenda item. For those of you who are in the audience who'd like to testify on this item, please come forward to this area right here. State and spell your name and provide your mailing address for the record. please state whether your testimony is in favor, in opposition, or neutral to this agenda item, and you will be given 3 minutes to provide your testimony.
Being Mark Barrow with Metropolitan Land Group, appreciate the opportunity to be back with you today, and I just thought I would offer a comment or two on the letter that I believe Dan provided to you. Do you all have a copy of the letter, by the way, or it's been circulated? Okay, so I maybe just want to Commissioner Bennett touch a little bit further on our interest there, just so it's clear. The vesting memo that's referred to in our letter was received by us yesterday. And our desire is to have what's captured in the memo, not just sit in a memo. We prefer that vesting information, that vesting commitment, that vesting process has been laid out by Joseph and Greg just be noted in the motion, in the action that's being taken by the Planning Commission this evening. And so that's why we have the suggested language that we recommended and that we requested, so that essentially that's something that is acknowledged by city memo can't be questioned later from a legislative standpoint, that it can't be changed later, changed tomorrow, changed next week or next month or next year administratively by the staff if it's noted in the adopted motion of the Planning Commission, and it's held in essentially in the code itself. So that was just a clarity that I wanted to offer tonight, just in that back and forth to make sure that it was clearly understood what our desires were. I did want to say, as the letter says from our company president, we've been most appreciative of the great partnership with Colin, with Dan, Rachel, Joseph, and Greg, and those Don, of course, who's no longer with the city, and we're excited to get going on this project. Appreciate all the thought you all are putting into this dialogue. An hour and 3/4 in, it's wonderful to see the commitment that you all have for making Hillsborough the best that it can be, and bringing this neighborhood on in a way that everyone can be proud of. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions if I'm here, and just request that you consider that in that light.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. I think you heard Mr. Oth's response to my question to him, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he described a process where what you're asking us to add is already in place. Do you disagree with that?
I think we're saying almost the same thing. It's in place, it's noted in this memorandum. I think our concern is that potentially down the line, there could be a different memorandum that would change that if it was adopted in the Planning Commission motion, if it was noted in the code itself. That's different. That's one step more assurance for the unpredictability of development going down the road. So perhaps if Joseph and Greg and Colin and I could have dialogue between now and city council action, maybe we could get to the same place. But in our read of the memo last night, we felt that in addition to the belts, some suspenders would be good as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other audience members wish to testify? All right, I'm seeing none.
President Nash,
Yes,
if I
of course.
could just real quick, I wanted to note that Metropolitan Land Group's letter is on the table if anyone would like to look at it. And then the other piece of testimony that the supplemental staff report that was attached for this evening's meeting includes letter we received from a representative from a property owner, so that is in the record. But I just want to point out, and I shared this with you, President Nash, that there is sorry for interrupting, because I know you want to take testimony from folks virtual as well, but just want to point out, I got an email from Lisa Duplessis, who shared that she is not able to make this evening's meeting, but wanted to provide written testimony to contest the potential future approval of a 5- and 6-story language in the code. And so I just wanted to make note of that, and that is in the copy that President Romash you have.
Yes, thank you. All right, Miguel, is there anyone pre-registered online to speak this evening?
President Ron Ash, we have no one pre-registered for testimony this evening. However, we do have people online. If anyone would like to testify on this agenda item, please use the raise hand button located on the bottom right of your Zoom toolbar. If you are joining via phone, please use *9. As you are unmuted, state and spell your name and provide your mailing address for the record. Please state whether your testimony is in favor, in opposition, or neutral. Your camera will not be turned on, and you will have 3 minutes to provide your testimony. Dawn will be keeping time for us. Okay.
Do we have anyone raising their hand?
We have a Cheryl who we are waiting to accept the ability to speak. Cheryl, are you ready? Cheryl, can you hear us? Did you change your mind on giving a statement, or is it technical difficulties?
Does look like she's unmuted, but perhaps her microphone is not working.
Okay, Cheryl, I'm going to go ahead and lower your hand.
Well, while we're waiting for Cheryl to maybe be able to raise her hand again, is there anyone else that has raised their hand?
I don't see anybody else raising their hand at this time.
Okay, so please let us know if Cheryl comes back with a raised hand, and we'll make sure that we can hear her testimony this evening. Okay, so staff, is there any other comments on the testimony that we heard this evening? Or any other additional information you'd like to give us?
So responding to the email I shared from Lisa Duplessis about the 5 and 6 stories, I want to reiterate to the Planning Commission this evening that that is limited to regular affordable housing. So not all market rate apartment buildings are allowed at that building height. And also to reiterate that the Senate Bill 8 that Rachel and I discussed increase the building height, so the 5 and 6 story development code language around regular affordable housing is fairly in line with where the state is requiring us to go. It shows up in another part of our development code, but we carried it forward here to which Hazel South Plan District to just to highlight it. And so Rachel, anything more to add on the building height front?
Thank you. All right, anybody else want to ask any questions? All right, so then, do I have a motion from the commission to close or continue the hearing?
I make a motion to close the hearing.
Do I have a second on that motion?
A second.
All right, I have a motion from Commissioner Fluid and a second by Commissioner Saka to close the public hearing. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. All right, now we get to deliberate. Who wants to go first?
President Thrallmash, if
Yes,
I might,
of course.
just a point of order quickly before the commission deliberates. In consulting with, Mr. Oth, from Transportation System Division, and in consideration of the testimony you've heard this evening, the staff is comfortable, if the planning commission is comfortable, considering in your motion to, and Joseph will have some language for you that we can provide to recognize this trip testing memo, which we've written and shared with them, but so something to the akin of adopting the Hazel Village Community Development Code with amendment, get to that, and also some language, and recognizing the February 7th trip testing, something to that effect. So I just wanted to throw that out as you begin your deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you for that update. All right, now let's go. Mr. Grillo?
I just have a question back to Mr. Cooper, Mr. Odd. I think you can work some language out as to the vesting of the trips. That's satisfactory to the city, then I'm fairly comfortable with that. Vesting numbers can be, we do not control all of the roads out there, or will be control all of the roads out there. And correct me if I'm wrong, River Road and then Brookwood in the future. And my only concern is that the city doesn't find itself boxed in, because somewhere down the road, before we get into whatever phase of South Witch Hazel, some other major project comes along, really brings up the ADTs or the peak hour or whatever, and causes the county to come back and say, well, hey, that's great, but you still got to make this improvement. The developer is going to come back and say, well, hey, I'm kind of vested, unless I'm missing something here, and the county will sit there and kind of go, that's nice, you still have to make this improvement. And so I'm just concerned if you don't, as a government standpoint, I understand with the government, we still want to box ourselves in. To me, I'd be a lot more comfortable if we control the universe. Well, we don't. So if I'm wrong here, then you guys are going to come up with some language that you can live with. But if I'm kind of partially right, then I don't know how you don't control, the developer doesn't control, the county and city isn't going to control other trips. They're running up and down River Road or some other big project which we cannot contemplate here. That's going to plop down under rows of development. Someone decided it's a great place to build a chip factory. We all gasp, look at the trip numbers, and we go, oh, well, we're in a certain amount of improvement. Well, it's on who's done. That's always the argument, right? Who's paying for it? So you guys come up with language that you know you don't want to get hooked. I'm all for it.
This is just what city's systems engineer. When we worked on the transportation planning rule analysis for Hazel Village South, we also did a sensitivity level analysis for the urban reserves, just to ensure that we didn't box ourselves in and just because it's like you said, we didn't want to find out later that hey, we need a widen the road because Rosewood comes in, but at the same time we don't want to preserve a bunch of right of way and find out hey, we don't need that later. And so so we did that kind of high sensitivity level with Rosewood South. So I feel like what we have here in the memo is very well written. We applied a similar approach to South Hillsborough, and we took into consideration of the future of Rosewood reserves, and so it's for purple with language in here, and it's not we're not going to find ourselves down the road Being like, oh man, we missed the opportunity here and now we're able to have a good location.
Anyone else? No? Well, I can speak now, while everybody else is thinking. I would like to echo what Commissioner Bennett said. I really appreciate all the staff's work on this. This is the first project that I've been through, enough of to really see how it is formed. And I do really appreciate the fact that the input from us, the input from the affordable housing developers has been really incorporated into this. I appreciate the city being willing to try something. We don't know really if it's going to work or not, or to what extent it's going to work, to what extent it's going to provide affordable housing. But you're not going to get different results unless you try something. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to approve something that's trying things to get some data about like, okay, is this gonna work or make a dent in the issue of affordable housing. So I really appreciate that. I'm also really I'm one of those people that gets really irritated that you can't walk to like get a cup of tea or something. And so, from a livability standpoint, I think that having small scale retail eating and drinking establishments, especially when this particular part of Hillsborough is not currently well served by transit. We are under no control, unfortunately, of whether it's going to be well served by transit, as Mr. Goodlow alluded to. That there might be options for people to get some need met within their neighborhood without having to go very far. I appreciate that as well. So I'm certainly in favor of approving this with the amendments that we've previously discussed. Next.
When we're talking about this area and we're already describing what percentage of it will go towards affordable housing, and we understand that it's quite possible that public transport won't be as accessible to this neighborhood, I want to reiterate that I want my neighbors in this area to have as many resources as possible. And I don't know if we really are discussing that. I hear in coffee shops and everything like that, but when we're talking about individuals who need affordable housing and what those families may require, I'm not hearing anything about how we're going to support and cultivate community. I was a little troubled when I heard that the public space is going to be under private ownership, and what that means for that area. I just want to be able to put it out there. I didn't hear anything about libraries. I didn't hear anything about certain spaces that would just be for the community to convene. So I just wanted to make sure I put a comment there.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I really like the city has been doing. With Hazel. That was my first time seeing that, so I would it would be awesome to adopt everything that you guys have in your draft.
Thank you.
Commissioner Swan here. I'm generally supportive of the steps you're taking in the same way that you mentioned. President Nash, it's a good step, it's a bold step, and I think it's a step in the right direction. And I would love to see it happen ultimately, but I think everything starts with an idea and some plans around that. So thank you to all of you, Colin and your staff, for working on this and giving the presentation today. I'm supportive with the amendments that we discussed today as well.
Mr. Bennett, do you have anything else to add?
I'll try to make this brief. I'm very sensitive to the comments that you've made. Commissioner Saka about having, community support for folks who will be living in housing that's more affordable. And that's, you're right, it's one thing to have a place to live, it's another thing to have a range of services that are handy, make it even better. I guess that doesn't foreclose the ability of at some point in time there being some kind of community facility there. I mean, there's, if you look at South Hillsborough there, the developer there, the master developer, there's done a good job of developing a space system that does help create a sense of community. Maybe that's what the parks in this project will do. I hope they do. I mean, I'm very hopeful that what the city parks department does, you know, it isn't a cookie cutter. They're not cookie cutter parks. If we have a substantial population of folks who are able to take advantage of housing that's less affordable, I'm not sure we can do anything about that. But I guess I would appreciate it if the staff would kind of write down a note that says we need to talk with parks and make sure that when they're deciding what the program is for these two parks, that that they think about more than just how many swings we have and you know, that kind of thing. And I'm not a park designer, right? I don't know what additional considerations would be undertaken, but I think that it's a very valid point that we need to make sure that we have a whole system that tends to work. I would like to think that if we build a fair amount of housing that's more affordable here, that maybe the transit will come, you know, and if you build it, it will come. Having said that, I guess I'll leave my comments about TriMet's affection for dealing with the city of Hillsborough to myself. Anyway, I'm sensitive to that. If there were more we could do, I certainly would be doing it. But I think we can do that in ways that are not necessarily implemented through this community. So with the, if you're ready for a motion, unless there are more comments.
I was just thinking, when I was on the back of Commissioner Saka and your comments, one of the things that is in this code is that there will be reduced open space. There can be reduced open space for those nonprofit developers who might want to come in and develop affordable housing. And so then I think the park system is going to be the most really important at that point, right? Because we're essentially we're going to be attempting to balance having enough units for people who need them with a reduced amount of green space. And especially if those families who move into those units have children, it's going to be really important for them to have access to parks and open spaces. And so, and I think that gets back to what Commissioner Saka is saying. Again, I don't think that we can do much, or we can't do much to dictate how parks ends up doing that. I'll know in the back of my head to keep track of it and maybe show up at a public hearing for that part or put input into things for the parks department may end up doing. But I did just want to add on to that. And then I suppose I am ready for motion unless anybody else has anything they'd like to say.
This is Commissioner Bennett, I would move adoption of order number 8403 for code amendment 003-22, subject to two amendments. One of which I'm going to ask for from transportation in regard to the February 7, 2023 memo. And the second is to incorporate the language that was read earlier by Ms. Marble. And Ms. Marble clarify for me, I think we're talking about section 12.68-110. Capital letter B dot 1. Okay, so with the language that she recommended be added to that section of code. So I guess I would wait for the language regarding the trip vesting memo of 2/7/23.
I will second that motion.
I gotta get the language first.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Motion to recognize and to submit into order number 8403, record the city of Hillsborough memorandum to which Hazel Village South file dated February 7th, 2023, regarding which Hazel Village South policy on vesting trips for land development prepared by Joseph Hawk and Greg Snyder.
And where does that get at?
Sorry, missed the question.
Where in the code do we add that?
We do not put it in the code, but put it as part of the record process.
Yeah, I think the compromise the staff's willing to do is just simply recognize it, thereby it's, in this motion, it's legislative, part of the legislative process.
Okay, so it becomes part of the record, it does not become. Correct. Okay, so I withdraw my comment about adding code language, but just adding the language to the record that was just read by Mr. Roth. That's the amendment.
I'll second that motion.
All right, so I have a motion by Commissioner Bennett and a second by Commissioner Ford to approve Community Development Code Amendment 00322 with the amended language as to phasing in affordable housing projects and recognizing the memo of dated 2/7/2023 to MLP about vesting trips. Take it all that. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Has anyone opposed? Anybody abstaining? All right, the motion carries.